Hey guys! Tonight we begin with the intimate corners of Roman civilization. We're talking about what ancient Roman sex parties were actually like. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Take a deep breath, let your shoulders relax. Feel the quiet hum of your space around you. Allow your mind to gently drift, preparing for a journey back through the veils of time. Chapter 1. The Roman Invitation and Initial Immersion. You didn't just attend one of these Roman parties. Oh no, that would be far too mundane. Instead, you were summoned, much like a minor deity might be called to a celestial banquet, or perhaps with slightly less enthusiasm, like a disappointing nephew being invited to a family gathering where his presence is required for optics. The invitation itself was a statement, a carefully crafted flex of power and prestige. It arrived as a wax-sealed scroll, its very weight in your hand implying we, the esteemed hosts, have chosen you, out of all the teeming masses of Rome, to grace our humble abode with your presence. It was an honor, yes, but also a gentle reminder that your every move, your every decision was known. They knew everything about you, or at least everything they needed to know to extend this selective invitation. As you approach the grand villa, a sense of quiet dread begins to settle in. You immediately regret your sartorial choices. You had tried to strike a balance, something that conveyed both respect and a hint of relaxed sophistication. Instead, as you glimpse the effortlessly scandalous attire of others already gathered, you realize you look like you've wandered in from a toga sales conference, perhaps still clutching a promotional pamphlet for olive oil. Too late now. The massive gates of the villa swing open with a slow, deliberate creak, not ominously, but more like they've witnessed centuries of whispered secrets and raucous laughter, and are simply too tired to be dramatic about it anymore. You step into the inner courtyard, where the evening air, thick with the scent of blooming roses and distant cooking fires, wraps around you like a soft, invisible cloak. In a secluded corner, a discreet fountain gurgles, its water murmuring softly, almost as if it's trying desperately not to listen to the private conversations unfolding within the villa's walls. Inside, the sheer scale of the space feels overwhelming. Servants move like trained shadows, their presence almost imperceptible, yet they are everywhere. They are there to adjust cushions with silent precision, to pour wine into goblets before you even realize you're thirsty, and somehow, through their very quiet efficiency, they manage to make you feel both ridiculously underdressed and oddly overhydrated at the same time. A few of them nod at you, their expressions a carefully neutral mask, the kind one might reserve for an anxious goat at a lion exhibit, a mixture of mild concern and profound detachment. Your host approaches, his toga flowing perfectly, a smile gracing his lips, that particular Roman smile, the one that effortlessly conveys, "Welcome to my home. I hope you enjoy yourself, truly, and please, for the love of the gods, don't get anything sticky on the exquisite mosaic floor. It's 4th century BC, you know." You try to reply with equal dignity, perhaps a witty Roman pleasantry, but mostly you just sweat slightly, feeling the dampness under your armpits, and bow a little too low, perhaps nearly toppling over. Around you, the elite of Roman society mingle with an almost predatory grace. Senators, their faces etched with the weight of political maneuvering, exchange pleasantries that sound suspiciously like veiled threats. Poets, their eyes gleaming with inspiration, or perhaps just too much wine, look as though they haven't bathed in weeks, yet can quote Plato mid-belch with astonishing accuracy. A general, his chest impossibly broad, walks by, holding a gleaming goblet in one hand and, you suspect, the immediate future of a small unfortunate province in the other. No one, not yet, is actually doing anything scandalous. But you can feel it, the electric hum of anticipation in the air. Everyone is thinking about it, hard. You are guided, or perhaps gently herded, to a couch. It's low to the ground, upholstered in rich, soft fabrics, but oddly angled, as if designed for a posture you haven't quite mastered. It feels deeply suspicious, like a trap disguised as comfort. You recline awkwardly, trying your absolute best to look like someone who attends these kinds of gatherings often, someone who definitely understands the unspoken social cues, and someone who knows precisely what's about to happen. You don't, not even a little. The air, already thick with roses, now carries the distinct, intoxicating aroma of aged wine, mingling with something else, something sharp and almost tangible, ambition. In the distance, someone plays a lyre, softly, tastefully, the notes drifting through the room like a gentle caress, almost like foreplay for the ears, subtly setting the mood. Everyone is waiting, waiting for that precise moment when the evening tips, when the carefully constructed facade begins to crack. It hasn't happened yet, not truly, but you know it will. It always does. One of the silently gliding slaves walks by, carrying a platter. It is shaped like something you are pretty sure shouldn't be edible, or, at the very least, should not be served in polite company. You pretend not to notice it, fixing your gaze on a distant wall, and in that precise moment of feigned indifference you have an epiphany. This isn't merely a party. No, this is less of a casual soiree and much more of a meticulously choreographed power play, subtly wrapped in silk sheets, served on an oddly shaped platter, and punctuated by the soft, whispered names of powerful men and women. Let's be clear, Roman villa parties weren't your typical come-one, come-all potlucks where you might show up with a bottle of questionable wine and hope someone else brought olives. This was an invite-only affair, where your social rank, your connections, and your utility mattered infinitely more than anything as frivolous as your personality. And frankly, Romans didn't really have personalities in the modern sense. They had titles, lineages, and suspiciously flexible morals that could bend to any social occasion. You didn't make the guest list because someone genuinely liked your charming wit or your delightful anecdotes. You made it because someone could use you, perhaps for political leverage, perhaps for a future business deal, or at the very least because they could count on you not to scream when things inevitably got a little theatrical. You take another discreet look around the room. That senator in the corner, his face a study in carefully cultivated gravitas, is renowned for passing 3 ambitious new laws this year. Less publicly known, he also divorced 3 wives last week. He's currently seated next to a poet whose last public reading, a sprawling epic, got banned for being just a touch too anatomically detailed for the public censors. Across from them, a priestess draped in flowing white technically shouldn't be here at all, given her sacred vows. But rumor has it she's either the emperor's niece, his ex-lover, or perhaps both. It's Rome, after all. Everything is fluid, and boundaries are merely suggestions. No one here is random. Every single person in this room, from the most stoic senator to the most scandalous poet, is a carefully placed piece on a chessboard. Seating, you realize with dawning horror, is an exact science. If you find yourself nestled near the main wine amphora, you're either designated entertainment, soon to be doing a highly regrettable interpretive dance, or you're considered a social liability, someone they don't trust with delicate conversations. If you're fortunate enough to be seated near the host, as you are, congratulations. You're being watched. You're not entirely sure whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but either way, you instinctively sit up straighter, trying to project an air of composed interest. Everyone is mingling under a thin, almost transparent veil of civility, like a gladiatorial match where the swords have been temporarily replaced with compliments. "Oh, Publius," you overhear one man say, his voice dripping with false concern. "You look so refreshed. I heard your trial was quite exhausting." Laughter follows, light and airy, punctuated by sips of wine, and then, you notice, a subtle, almost imperceptible threat delivered with a knowing glance. The usual. Eye contact, you learn quickly, is a nuanced weapon here. A glance that lingers even a second too long implies profound interest, perhaps an invitation. A glance that doesn't happen at all is a blatant insult, a dismissal. Accidentally locking eyes with someone's spouse is how minor scandals begin. Accidentally locking eyes with both of them, however, is apparently how you get invited to the next party. You try to strike up a polite conversation, opting for a safe topic, something agrarian, perhaps about the recent olive harvest. Someone counters your well-meaning question with a convoluted anecdote involving a grain shortage, 3 acrobats, and a surprisingly detailed explanation of Roman tax law. You nod politely, pretending to follow along, and make a mental note to never ever ask about wheat again. In this room, everything, absolutely everything, is a performance. Your posture, the timbre of your laughter, even the precise way you sip your wine. Too fast, and you're uncultured, perhaps a glutton. Too slow, and you're plotting something, a suspicious figure. You just want to remain neutral, unassuming, and utterly unmemorable, which, you realize with a sinking feeling, is truly impossible in Rome. But at least you're not the guy who, rumor has it, brought his mother to one of these gatherings. He hasn't been seen since. You start to notice something truly odd, aside from the room full of reclining aristocrats who are all pretending to be shy and demure. It's the sheer number of people gliding silently around the periphery, always with perfect posture, no personal space, and a look in their eyes that says, "Yes, I have seen things. No, I will not be emotionally unpacking them, not ever." These, you understand, are the slaves. And make no mistake, they are not partygoers. They are the essential infrastructure, the living, breathing cogs that make this elaborate, decadent machine function. There's one adjusting the cushions every 12 seconds, ensuring maximum recline. Another pours wine with surgical precision, somehow knowing precisely who prefers dry Falernian and who wants theirs forget last Tuesday strong. One is fanning a guest, making it look like an Olympic sport, every stroke timed perfectly. Another is juggling trays of fruit shaped like things that make you actively avoid eye contact. They are everywhere, yet no one acknowledges them, unless of course something goes wrong. in which case they are suddenly very visible and somehow always to blame. You try, just for a moment, smiling at one of them, a small, tentative gesture of shared humanity. They blink twice, a subtle, almost imperceptible movement, which you quickly realize might be the ancient Roman equivalent of don't. You look away, feigning an intense admiration for a wall mosaic, which, unfortunately, depicts something you're pretty sure isn't anatomically possible, even for a minor deity. The strange part, the truly unsettling part, is that these slaves, these silent shadows, know more than anyone else in this room. They know who's sleeping with whom, who's trying to poison whom, and who brought their distant, disreputable cousin under a fake name. They are walking, silent scrolls of blackmail potential, living repositories of every secret, every indiscretion, every whispered lie, and yet they are completely ignored, like morally flexible wallpaper. Some are trained specifically for entertainment, their bodies honed for dancing or acrobatic feats. Others are trained for more interactive hosting, their smiles practiced, their hands quick. But none of them get to leave early. None of them get a couch. If anything, they are the couch, a living, breathing piece of furniture upon which the elite recline. You're not sure if that's part of the act, an elaborate display, or just incredibly bad ergonomics. And yet, while the guests are busy trying to out-charm, out-maneuver, or out-undress one another, the slaves are running the entire complex machine. Quietly, efficiently, judging you just a little, which you grudgingly admit is entirely fair. You overhear one guest, their voice slurring slightly with wine, ask, "Who's that attractive man over there with the wine?" The host, without missing a beat, responds, "That? Oh, he's no one." You sip your own drink, nod slowly, and mentally add, "No one is the only reason this entire place hasn't collapsed into utter chaos." You raise your glass, almost imperceptibly, to the nearest servant. He doesn't look at you directly, but you swear, for half a second, his eyebrow twitches. Respect. Chapter 2. The Flow of Roman Indulgence. Let's be clear, this entire elaborate event hinges on one crucial, flowing element: wine. Not engaging conversation, not high social status, not even the oil-slicked dancers with the suspiciously flexible spines. Just wine. Without it, the evening would devolve into a networking disaster, a room full of stiff-backed aristocrats nervously discussing tax reforms. With it, however, it becomes a networking disaster with a distinct sense of style, a more lubricated, far more scandalous affair. As you recline awkwardly on your oddly angled couch, a servant, appearing as if from thin air, pours your first cup. Roman wine, you quickly discover, is not like modern wine. For starters, it's far stronger than your current will to avoid drama, and it absolutely needs to be diluted. Not, you learn, to preserve decorum in the ancient sense, but because drinking it straight is how you end up proposing marriage to a marble statue, or worse, challenging a senator to a poetry duel. The Romans don't merely sip wine, they perform with it. Each cup is followed by a toast, a witty quip, and a subtle, almost imperceptible glance at the person across from you, designed to gauge their reaction. Are they impressed, scandalized, or, ideally, both? You try, with noble intentions, to pace yourself, to sip slowly, and maintain an air of dignified sobriety. You fail, spectacularly. By the third cup, your Latin, which usually consists of basic greetings and directions to the nearest latrine, is suddenly flawless. You find yourself constructing complex rhetorical questions and debating the finer points of Stoic philosophy with surprising confidence. By the fourth cup, you're nodding along enthusiastically to a convoluted story involving the sea god Neptune, a rather unfortunate goose, and an obscure legal loophole that, to your suddenly brilliant mind, seems utterly fascinating. It's at this stage that people truly start leaning in. Voices drop to hushed tones. The laughter gets breathier, more intimate, a little wild around the edges. Jokes, which began innocently enough, start sounding less like humor and more like direct offers. You begin to realize that the question, "Would you like a fig?" might not, in fact, be solely about the fruit. You also realize, with a slight internal jolt, that you've probably accepted, whatever it was. The wine flows freely, as do the stories, none of which seem entirely true. One man, his eyes shining with a combination of intoxication and self-importance, claims to have bathed with a Vestal virgin, a pronouncement that makes you almost choke on your diluted wine. Another swears he once dined with Cleopatra's cousin's astrologer, implying a deep connection to exotic power. Someone else insists, with a dramatic flourish of his hand, that the emperor himself once asked them for advice on matters of the heart. Everyone else in the room nods politely, their faces carefully neutral, while mentally ranking these audacious lies from barely plausible to "Please, for the love of Jupiter, put down the goblet." It's a game, you realize, a contest of who can weave the most impressive, most scandalous, or most subtly self-aggrandizing tale. And then the host speaks. Not loudly, not with a sudden shout, but with a quiet, confident authority that seems to ripple through the room. Everyone quiets, the chatter dying down like a fading breeze. Whatever is about to happen next, perhaps a new set of musicians, a more elaborate performance, or a subtle change in the lighting that signals a shift in gears, it always begins precisely after the host makes a remark that could either be profound poetry or an innuendo so ancient it's likely carved on some forgotten tablet. You swell your drink, attempting to look like someone who has seen this precise moment unfold countless times before, someone who understands its unspoken significance. You haven't, of course, but you've committed to the charade now. One more cup, you think, and you might just have the courage to pretend you fully understand Roman social cues, or alternatively, you'll simply pass out gracefully in a potted plant. Either way, you are now irrevocably part of the evening's unfolding narrative. By now, you've fully accepted that this party, this entire sprawling event, is operating under its own unique set of rules, one of which seems to be that nothing, absolutely nothing, can just be food. Every platter that arrives from the unseen kitchens looks like it came directly from the workshop of an erotic sculptor with far too much time on their hands and an alarming abundance of fresh pastry dough. You observe a tray of figs, carefully arranged and shaped in ways that are undeniably suggestive, mirroring certain body parts. Oysters are presented not merely on a bed of ice, but arranged in delicate, almost provocative spirals. Even the bread loaves, warm and inviting, clearly did not rise to their specific, undeniably phallic shapes by accident. And the honey cakes, sweet and glistening, seemed to wink at you from their decorative trays. You're not entirely sure if you're supposed to eat them, admire them, or simply blush furiously and politely excuse yourself to the nearest discreet corner. You cautiously reach for what looks like a cluster of innocent dates, only to find them cunningly stuffed with something squishy, tart, and suspiciously symbolic. No one else seems fazed. This, you gather, is clearly normal. Somewhere across the vast room, a distinguished senator is holding a sausage with the reverence usually reserved for a sacred relic. He bites into it with exaggerated ceremony, his eyes closed as if savoring a profound truth. You lose your appetite. Across from him, a woman, her arm draped elegantly over a reclining magistrate, is hand-feeding him grapes, one by one, with the sort of intense focus usually reserved for hostage negotiations. Each grape disappears into his mouth with an almost ritualistic slowness. He chews contemplatively, then praises its texture. You're not entirely sure if he means the grape or something else entirely. The centerpiece of the feast is a magnificent roast, possibly a boar, possibly something else that once had a name and, you imagine, profound regrets. It's been decorated with an abundance of fruits, strategically placed in areas where fruits simply do not belong. A flute player provides ambient music, the notes weaving through the space, while a servant delicately slices into the roast, revealing yet another surprise layer of something gelatinous and deeply, deeply unnerving. You nibble at a small pastry, shaped unmistakably like Venus. It tastes vaguely of almond and, disturbingly, of poor decisions. Meanwhile, the host, ever the master of ceremonies, raises a goblet, his voice clear and resonant, and praises the cook with an almost theatrical flourish. Everyone claps politely, as if they haven't just collectively consumed an entire, elaborate metaphor for Roman excess and moral flexibility. The cook, a shadowy figure, bows low and retreats into the darkness, presumably to prepare dessert, which, if this pattern holds, will likely look like either an animal, a deity, or something that would get you fined in 3 different provinces. And yet, despite the culinary chaos and the strange, unsettling symbolism, the message is clear. This isn't just nourishment. This is theatre. This is symbolism. This is, in essence, a very elaborate and rather expensive way of saying we have far too much money, absolutely no filter, and a profound appreciation for the absurd. You take another bite of the Venus pastry. It's spicy. Of course it is. Everything here is. Chapter 3. Roman Entertainment and Seduction. Just when you think the evening can't possibly get any more interpretive, just when you believe you've reached the peak of culinary and social absurdity, the lyre player changes tempo. The notes, once soft and inviting, become faster, more rhythmic, almost insistent. And the room, subtly, collectively, tilts. No one says, "Now the show begins." There's no official announcement, no fanfare. But somehow, inexplicably, everyone knows. The host leans back further on his couch, a knowing, almost predatory gleam in his eyes. The wine is refilled, silently, magically, almost before your goblet is half empty. And then a performer steps forward. And suddenly, with a quiet rustle of silk, you realize you're no longer at a mere party. You're at a talent show hosted by Dionysus on a particularly audacious dare. The first act is a dancer. She emerges from behind a curtain, a shimmering vision, clad in silk, barely, and enough body oil to fry an entire fish market. She moves with an almost supernatural grace, as if gravity is merely an optional suggestion, and direct eye contact with the audience is a punishable offense. You want to look away, to be discreet, but you realize that looking away would somehow be even more awkward, drawing more attention to your discomfort than if you just kept watching. So you nod along, trying to project an air of sophisticated understanding, as if you fully grasp the profound cultural significance of the part where she starts miming an eagle or perhaps a particularly agitated pigeon. Maybe it's deeply mythological, Maybe it's allegorical, a commentary on the fleeting nature of power. Or maybe, you decide, you're just wildly overthinking it, and you should simply drink more wine. Definitely more wine. Next comes a man with a lute, his face radiating an almost shocking lack of shame. He strums a few chords, then launches into an ode to Venus that manages to rhyme love with dove and above, and somehow, against all odds, makes all three words sound utterly inappropriate and deeply suggestive. You clap along politely, feeling a blush creep up your neck. Everyone else, however, laughs with genuine, unrestrained glee, as if it's the funniest thing since the sack of Carthage. Then there's the juggler. He starts with a seemingly innocuous array of fruit, moves on to a bewildering display of gleaming knives, and concludes his act with something you're pretty sure was strictly illegal even in ancient Athens. The crowd gasps, a collective intake of breath. You, however, try to look bored, as if this is standard weekend fare at your villa, and attempt, unsuccessfully, not to choke on a decorative almond that has somehow made its way into your mouth. But the real highlight of the evening, the showstopper, is always the theatrical reenactments. These are, you quickly discover, very loose interpretations of classical mythology. And by very loose, you mean, are we absolutely sure this isn't just highly elaborate fan fiction with props? Tonight's performance is The Rapture of Ganymede, a story you vaguely remember from your schooling, or at least you thought you did. This version, however, features interpretive moaning, 3 strategically placed laurel wreaths that barely cover anything, and what appears to be a startling cameo by a man in a horse mask. When it finally ends, mercifully, everyone claps with enthusiastic vigor. Even the flute player looks utterly exhausted, perhaps mentally scarred. You begin to realize, with a slight internal shudder, that the entertainment isn't here to distract from the party. It is the party. It sets the tone, it opens the door, it systematically removes the last lingering illusion of formality. After this, anything goes, and probably will. You sip your wine, applaud, and surrender to the evening. You're not sure what you just watched, but it was undeniably Roman. There's a specific, almost palpable moment in every Roman evening when the vibe shifts. It transitions from polite decadence to a far more dangerous, exhilarating, and unspoken realm of let's see what happens. That moment arrives precisely 4 seconds after someone, usually a senator who has had a few too many cups of diluted Falernian, jokes, "It's getting rather warm in here." And everyone, in unison, chuckles a little too eagerly, a collective sound that betrays more than amusement. A few guests, seemingly spontaneously, begin to loosen their togas. Not all the way, not yet, that would be truly scandalous. But just enough to send a clear, non-verbal signal that says, "I'm relaxed," without explicitly adding, "and available." Togas, for the record, are not easy garments. They are made of enough fabric to clothe an entire small village, intricately draped and held together by sheer stubbornness and perhaps a few well-placed fibulae. Watching a distinguished senator attempt to disrobe gracefully is an exercise in both amusement and profound pity, like watching a majestic swan trip clumsily over its own dignity. You glance around, unsure of the precise protocol. There's no official announcement, no trumpet sounds to signify that it's time for revealing choices. It's just a subtle, almost imperceptible cascade. First, one bare shoulder emerges, then another. Then suddenly, a full chest exposed under the flickering torchlight, glistening as if it has been meticulously rehearsed for this very moment. Nobody says anything outright, but the looks exchanged become undeniably more suggestive. Compliments flow more freely, but now with a deeper, more resonant subtext. A woman compliments a man's biceps with the same tone one might use to praise civic infrastructure. Strong, reliable, slightly intimidating. You try to remain cool, aloof, but now your own toga suddenly feels like a sweaty wool prison, stifling and utterly uncooperative. Someone, a woman with a mischievous glint in her eye, leans towards you and offers to help you loosen it. You politely decline, instantly regretting your decision. Too hesitant, too shy, or worse, too sober. There's a fine art to undressing in this particular crowd. Too fast, and you're over-eager, almost vulgar. Too slow, and you're repressed, perhaps even morally rigid. The sweet spot, you observe, is accidentally seductive while merely adjusting a sandal, a feigned casualness that is anything but. Sadly, you land squarely on the aesthetic of stiff tax collector on holiday. Someone near you, a man whose face is now a mask of blissful intoxication, starts a new toast. To Bacchus, he slurs, raising his cup, to pleasure, and to forgetting names. The laughter that follows is genuine now, a little wild, a little unrestrained around the edges. It's the kind of laugh that says, we all know exactly where this is going, and we're all pretending we don't. And still, despite the increasingly suggestive atmosphere, no one overtly breaks the spell. This isn't a sprint, you realize. It's a slow, deliberate slide into something unspoken, a mutual understanding. The wine, the rhythmic music, the soft, inviting candlelight, it all works together, a sensual conspiracy. You adjust your toga, raise your goblet, and offer your most mysterious smile to the person next to you. They smile back, their expression holding the exact suggestion of someone who is about to propose something outrageous, probably in perfectly nuanced Latin. By now, you've fully realized that nothing, absolutely nothing in this villa happens by accident. Not the endless flow of expensive wine, not the olives that somehow look like subtle metaphors, and certainly not the intricate, almost theatrical dance of flirtation. Roman flirtation isn't loud or clumsy like a market vendor hawking his wares. It's not even direct, a simple proposition. It's more like an Olympic event in subtlety, conducted through a complex language of glances, veiled comments, and, astonishingly, even the precise manner in which you peel a fig. Yes, apparently, even your fruit-eating technique is under meticulous surveillance. The woman across the room, her eyes sparkling in the candlelight, hasn't said a single word to you directly, but she just brushed her hand along a silk curtain, her gaze pointed unmistakably in your direction. You don't know what it means, not precisely, but a nearby poet, his head lolling slightly with wine, is nodding approvingly, as if you just witnessed a sonnet unfold before your very eyes. You attempt your own subtle move, reclining slightly further on your suspiciously soft couch, aiming to project an air of nonchalant confidence. Unfortunately, the couch cushion, as if in league with the gods, betrays you, and you sink too far, ending up in a pose best described as a collapsed senator. So smooth. The man next to you, who seems to have recovered from his earlier toast, chuckles softly, offers a steadying hand, and says, "Don't worry, I once fell into a brazier trying to impress a Vestal." Comforting? Perhaps. Concerning? Definitely. You notice that conversations have subtly shifted in tone. Earlier it was all high politics, abstract philosophy, and who brought the best honeyed dormice. Now every sentence seems to be laden with double meanings. every vocal inflection a subtle hint. Would you like more wine might now mean, do you want to sit closer to me? Or possibly, let's vanish behind that curtain and discuss Cicero loudly but not really. Body language, you realize, is everything. A lingering touch on the stem of a goblet, a laugh that lasts one syllable too long, resonating with a deeper meaning. A shared glance at a performance where both of you definitely noticed the exact same scandalous prop. And through it all, no one, absolutely no one, rushes. Romans are patient flirters. They build tension the way their architects build temples. Slowly, deliberately, and with an alarming number of decorative details that only hint at the true purpose. You're trying your best to keep up, to decipher the elaborate code, but it feels like everyone else studied from a playbook you somehow didn't receive. The innuendo is layered, almost geological in its complexity. The metaphors are confusing, requiring advanced classical knowledge. And someone just used the phrase plucking Jupiter's apple with an astonishingly straight face. Still, despite the bewilderment, there's a certain thrill in it all. The delicate, dangerous dance of saying everything without actually saying anything. You swirl your wine, meet a gaze from across the room, and offer your most mysterious, enigmatic smile. You have no idea what you just agreed to, what unspoken invitation you just accepted, but apparently that's precisely the point. The evening is deepening, blurring the lines between politeness and proposition, between social nicety and sensual conspiracy. The air feels charged, electric, as the subtle game of Roman seduction reaches its peak. Chapter 4. Roman Power Plays and the Morning After. You've survived the torrent of toasts, navigated the treacherous waters of flirty fig metaphors, and even endured a man reciting highly questionable poetry about goat thighs. At this point, you feel ready for whatever else this opulent, utterly baffling Roman villa has to throw at you. And that's when you notice them. The curtains. Not just regular functional household curtains. No, these are strategically placed swaths of rich, heavy fabric, hung across archways, tucked provocatively into columns, and fluttering mysteriously in a breeze that shouldn't, logically, exist indoors. Still, despite the bewilderment, there's a certain thrill in it all. The delicate, dangerous dance of saying everything without actually saying anything. You swirl your wine, meet a gaze from across the room, and offer your most mysterious, enigmatic smile. You have no idea what you just agreed to, what unspoken invitation you just accepted, but apparently that's precisely the point. The evening is deepening, blurring the lines between politeness and proposition, between social nicety and sensual conspiracy. The air feels charged, electric, as the subtle game of Roman seduction reaches its peak. Chapter 4. Roman Power Plays and the Morning After. You've survived the torrent of toasts, navigated the treacherous waters of flirty fig metaphors, and even endured a man reciting highly questionable poetry about goat thighs. At this point, you feel ready for whatever else this opulent, utterly baffling Roman villa has to throw at you. And that's when you notice them. The curtains. Not just regular functional household curtains. No, these are strategically placed swaths of rich, heavy fabric, hung across archways, tucked provocatively into columns, and fluttering mysteriously in a breeze that shouldn't, logically, exist indoors. They don't merely divide rooms, they imply possibilities. They whisper with a rustle of silk, "Hey, what if?" Some guests, their faces now flushed with wine and a certain adventurous spirit, begin to drift behind these curtains. They go in pairs, sometimes in trios, or in the kind of groupings that would require a full Roman census to accurately count. Each departure is remarkably casual. A little more wine, a shared knowing glance, a soft, almost inaudible, "Shall we?" followed by a practiced shuffle into linen obscurity. You try desperately not to stare, to maintain an air of sophisticated detachment. You fail, but to your credit, so does everyone else. There's a subtle, unspoken acknowledgement in the main hall, the kind of collective agreement where everyone pretends this is completely normal, while simultaneously trying to discreetly peek just a little, perhaps angling their heads for a better view. No one speaks of what happens beyond the curtains, not directly at least. Some guests return, hours later, looking flushed and glowing, as if they've just debated the finer points of Stoicism with their entire soul. Others return, looking like they might have physically wrestled a satyr, their togas askew, their hair dishevelled. A select few don't return at all, possibly out of profound embarrassment, or perhaps they've simply joined a touring theatrical troupe mid-party. It's genuinely unclear. Eventually, someone with the sculpted confidence of a marble bust and the voice of a philosophy professor on wine number 6 approaches you. They gesture languidly toward a nearby curtain, their eyes gleaming with playful invitation, and say, "Care to explore the finer points of Roman hospitality?" You panic, your mind racing for a suitably Roman, yet politely dismissive response. You blurt out, "I'm just here for the dates." They raise a perfectly sculpted eyebrow, a mixture of impression and confusion on their face, and then, with a graceful shrug, disappear behind the curtain with someone else who is probably much better at interpreting metaphors. And honestly, you're entirely fine with that. You've reached a point in the evening where it's perfectly acceptable to just recline, sip your wine, and observe as the party folds into softer layers of candlelight and veiled mystery. Not everyone, you notice, goes behind the curtains. Some are content to stay in the main hall, talking, laughing, and pretending not to notice that the floor is slowly becoming a mosaic of discarded sandals and questionable decisions. You lean back further, savoring your drink, and silently thank the gods for Roman architecture with its excellent ventilation. By now, you've completely figured out that nothing, truly nothing in this villa happens by accident. Not the vintage of the wine, not the subtly suggestive olives that somehow look like abstract metaphors, and certainly not the carefully orchestrated flirting. Roman flirtation isn't clumsy or loud. It's an Olympic event in subtlety, conveyed through lingering glances, veiled comments, and even the precise way you peel a fig. Yes, apparently, even your fruit technique is under surveillance. You begin to realize that these parties aren't just about indulgence, they're about advancement. Because after the curtain fluttering and the fig-flavored flirting comes a quieter, far more dangerous game, pillow talk diplomacy. You see, while you were busy overanalyzing a grape's symbolism, others were forging the ancient version of LinkedIn connections, except in togas and usually horizontally. Behind those perfumed curtains, secrets are whispered, deals are struck, and somehow someone's grand villa just got approved for renovation without going through the Senate. All of this, mind you, while reclining on a silk cushion that smells faintly of old wine, naked ambition, and vague regret. You overhear a man, his voice a low murmur, saying, "Of course, I support your cousin's candidacy." He delivers the line in the same casual tone one might use to offer a second serving of dormice. Later, that same man is seen writing something down on a wax tablet, his stylus moving with what can only be described as sultry urgency. This, you understand, is where Roman politics truly thrives, not in grand marble halls, but in torchlit corners filled with soft voices and even softer moral boundaries. The Senate might debate the law, but the villa bedroom, that's where the actual outcomes are negotiated. A woman wearing nothing but exquisite jewelry and an abundance of confidence lounges nearby, delicately asking a visiting general if he might consider transferring a few legions closer to her family's estate. He agrees, of course. Who wouldn't, given the persuasive power of grapes, charm, and, implicitly, powerful blackmail? You begin to realize that your position on the couch matters as much as your position on civic reform. Being seen with the right person, or not seen, depending on the curtain density, can dramatically shift your entire reputation. One misplaced compliment or an unfortunate giggle, and suddenly you're that guest, forever remembered in hushed tones and dismissive footnotes. Someone leans in, their breath warm with wine, and murmurs, "Did you hear about the new tax on olive oil?" It sounds innocent, a casual piece of gossip. It's not. In Rome, even condiments come with consequences. You do your best to contribute, to appear insightful. You nod wisely, reference a philosopher you vaguely remember, and say something profound about fate and civic duty. Someone claps. You think it's sarcastic, but you'll take it. Because here, in this soft-lit room, full of half-truths and full goblets, power is passed through lips, not speeches, and nothing, absolutely nothing, is ever just small talk. Eventually, the party stops pretending to be civilized. Somewhere around the 7th toast and the 3rd round of interpretive lyre solos, the night truly shifts. Things blur, faces blend into a hazy tapestry. Your toga, you realize with a jolt, ends up somewhere that is decidedly not on you. But just when you think the chaos is reaching peak Roman levels, when you expect a full-blown bacchanalian riot, someone, with astonishing composure, announces breakfast. The Romans called it gentaculum, but let's be honest, it's damage control with olives. You awaken, if you even slept, on a cushioned floor near a marble statue of Bacchus, who looks as though he's seen entirely too much and is entirely too pleased about it. A servant, moving with the same silent efficiency as the night before, offers you honey cakes and a lukewarm cup of watered wine. It tastes, you decide, like bad decisions and grapes that should have retired last season. Around you, guests begin to reassemble themselves, adjusting tunics and dignity with equal care. No one talks about what happened. That would be crass, uncivilized. Instead, everyone defaults to cheerful banalities like, "Lovely breeze last night, wasn't it?" or "Did you try the quail? Simply divine." As if they didn't just participate in something that could, quite literally, collapse a minor republic. The host, somehow glowing and wrinkle-free, strolls through the room, looking as if he hasn't watched senators snore next to courtesans and poets recite drunken odes to their sandals. He smiles, claps someone on the back, and you realize, with a slight internal shudder, he's already planning the next one. Because of course he is. Rome never rests. It merely naps in segments, preparing for the next grand, scandalous performance. Someone hands you a small clay token. You ask what it is. A memento, they say, their eyes twinkling. You press them. What kind of memento? They simply smile, turn, and walk away. You decide, wisely, not to ask again. There are quiet goodbyes, knowing glances exchanged between various pairings, and the occasional awkward moment when two guests realized they shared a curtain but not a name. One man leaves wearing someone else's sandals. Another leaves with someone else's senator. You gather your scattered things, some of which now include a philosophical scroll you don't recall owning, a bruised plum, and at least 3 highly questionable rumors about prominent figures. You make your way slowly toward the exit. You pass a servant scrubbing something unidentifiable off a mosaic. He doesn't make eye contact, neither do you. It's a mutual respect, an unspoken acknowledgement of shared experience. As you step back into the blinding Roman daylight, blinking and blurry, you realize something profound. This wasn't just a party. It was a masterclass in excess, a carefully choreographed feat of social engineering, and a surprisingly effective use of creative upholstery. And you survived it. Barely. You thought the party ended when the wine ran out and someone accidentally knocked over a bust of Minerva. But in Rome, the real party begins the morning after, in whispered conversations, raised eyebrows, and suddenly shifting political tides. Welcome to the gladiator arena of reputation management. By lunchtime, half the city knows that Senator Publius left with a woman described only as the Panther. The other half knows she wasn't actually a guest. She was, shall we say, a highly strategic acquisition. You overhear someone at the public bathhouse say, with a knowing sigh, well, at least it wasn't as bad as last time, which only raises more unsettling questions. You, on the other hand, are desperately trying to remember if you said anything truly regrettable to the wrong person, like, oh, maybe that story you told about Caesar's sandals being overrated. That would have been fine, perfectly acceptable, if you hadn't told it to Caesar's second cousin, who, it turns out, is remarkably sensitive about family footwear. And that charming, entirely innocent conversation with the courtesan about grain prices. Turns out she's the unofficial advisor to a praetor, which might explain why he winked at you in the forum this morning. The thing is, these parties aren't just about indulgence. They are, in fact, strategic traps lined in velvet. Every joke you made, every toast you gave, every single time you mispronounced delicious while complimenting the fish, all of it is being meticulously catalogued, judged, and quite possibly reenacted by people with dramatic flair and far too much leisure time. Still, not all fallout is bad. You notice someone nod at you across the forum, a subtle approving gesture, a silent recognition that you held your own, didn't spill your wine on any sacred texts, and managed not to pass out on a marble plinth. Word travels fast, and so does gossip, but so does status. If you played your cards and your couch placement right, you hear of one guest being invited to a magistrate's villa next week. Apparently, she told a particularly clever joke involving Cicero and olives. Another is rumored to have secured a lucrative shipping contract right after complimenting the host's peacock. Coincidence? Hardly. You've been invited to a small gathering. Nothing like that madness last night, your new acquaintance insists, which is Roman for exactly like that madness, but with slightly better cushions. Congratulations, you're officially on the circuit. So here you are, back from the party, back in your modest domus, and wondering, was any of that normal? The short answer, in Rome, absolutely. The long answer? Only if you can cite at least 2 gods as references for your behavior. Roman morality was flexible, extraordinarily flexible, like a master yogi in sandals. It was the kind of flexibility that could twist itself into an ethical pretzel and still stand upright, raising a toast to virtue. You might assume that all this lavish debauchery would be frowned upon, censured, but the Romans had a remarkably simple rule. If a god did it first, it's probably fine. Take Bacchus, the god of wine and general bad decisions. His entire mythos is essentially one long, glorious toga malfunction. Want to justify a party that ends with 4 strangers under a fruit platter? Easy. Just call it a bacchanalia. Want to discuss love in loud whispers with someone else's spouse? Venus would approve, surely. She invented flirty chaos, after all. This divine loophole allowed Romans to behave outrageously, then promptly write philosophical essays about how it brought them closer to the divine. Imagine waking up with wine-stained fingers and confidently claiming, "I now understand the cosmos better." And people just nod, because that, apparently, is theology. You begin to notice that Roman society functions less like a rigid hierarchy and more like a pantheon in motion. Everyone models their behavior on some mythological figure. A well-dressed man at the Forum brags about being a Mars in bed, while a woman retorts she's more of a Minerva by day, a Venus by night. You can't tell if it's flirtation or a theology quiz. Meanwhile, Stoic philosophers wander the city, insisting that pleasure is a distraction from true virtue, and then get caught sneaking into parties, claiming it's for philosophical interest. Hypocrisy? No, just the dual nature of man. Thank you very much. You finally ask a local if any of this ever causes a genuine scandal. He shrugs, offers a half smile, and says, "Only if you do it badly." Because the truth is, morality in Rome wasn't about abstaining. It was about style, discretion, and whether or not you quoted poetry while doing it. So you take comfort in the fact that if the gods themselves behaved like this, well, who are you to argue? You survived the wine, the curtain rooms, the poetry that bordered on a felony. And now, weeks later, you've returned to the daily grind of Roman life. But something has changed. You're walking through the Forum trying to haggle over olive prices when someone whispers, "That's the one who quoted Horace while juggling grapes." You want to correct them. It was actually Virgil, and you only dropped 1 grape, thank you very much. But you let it slide. Why ruin a legend? Because that's what these parties are now. Legends. Not just to you, but to everyone who wasn't there, which conveniently includes nearly everyone. The stories get wilder with each retelling. Someone says they saw a senator riding a peacock. Another swears there was a performance involving honey, masks, and philosophical role-play. You know for a fact that the masks were optional. Of course, not all the legacy is flattering. Moralists start publishing scrolls with titles like "The Decline of Virtue in the Marble Age" and "Toga Off, Empire Falls." Senators who participated issue vague denials, while you suspect planning the next banquet. And every few months, an emperor threatens to ban immoral assemblies right before hosting one that includes imported flamingos and interpretive dance about the Punic Wars. But the truth is, these parties were never just about excess. They were a mirror, a warped, wine-streaked mirror reflecting Rome's greatest paradox, an empire obsessed with order, constantly seduced by chaos. The grand villas, the rustling silk, the gods invoked between courses. They weren't distractions from Roman identity. They were Roman identity. The parties didn't mock the Republic. They were its natural extension, just with better lighting and worse decisions. Even as the empire changes, as marble fades and villas crumble, the memory of these gatherings lingers in dusty scrolls, in gossip carved into bathroom walls, in that one statue of Bacchus that definitely looks too pleased with himself. And you're now part of that lore, a footnote in someone else's over-embellished story. Maybe they'll say you danced on a table. Maybe they'll say you debated Plato while balancing fruit on your head. Either way, you left an impression. And in Rome, that's the real legacy. So here you are, back on your modest stone bench, sipping a lukewarm cup of watered wine, trying to piece together what exactly you just lived through. Was it a cultural event, a social trap, a toga-based fever dream? Yes, to all of it. Roman villa parties weren't simply about wine, scandal, or impressively flexible interpretations of mythology. They were how Rome functioned. Behind every curtain, under every laurel wreath, deals were struck, alliances formed, egos inflated and occasionally deflated by poor dance choices. It was government, entertainment and philosophy, all wrapped in silk and scandal. An empire conducting business in its bathrobe. The elite didn't separate politics from pleasure. That's a modern fantasy. In ancient Rome, the best networking happened while half-dressed and halfway into a haiku about Neptune. One well-timed toast could shift the fate of an entire province, one ill-timed belch exiled to a less fashionable island. And despite the excess, the Romans saw nothing strange about it. To them, this was tradition, a callback to older rituals when pleasing the gods meant song, wine, and maybe some interpretive wrestling under torchlight. The real mystery isn't that these parties happened, it's that they worked. Somehow, from all this candle-lit chaos, emerged an empire that built roads, aqueducts, and the foundation for modern law. Not bad for people who thought figs were an aphrodisiac and that dinner entertainment should include satirical mime. You've emerged from the haze changed. Wiser, maybe. Stickier, definitely. You've learned how to spot a disguised power play in a compliment, how to recline without spinal regret, and how to politely decline honeyed dormice without insulting the chef's grandmother. And now, as you return to normal Roman life, or whatever counts as normal when your neighbor owns a statue of Mercury wearing nothing but confidence, you carry a new understanding. These weren't just parties. They were theatre, ritual, politics, gossip incubators, and yes, occasionally chaos in sandal form. You smile to yourself, adjust your toga, which is finally staying in place, and walk off into the forum. One more Roman with secrets, stories, and just enough plausible deniability to be invited back. Because in Rome, the curtain never really closes. Chapter 5. The Fabric of Medieval Society. Fashion and Control. In medieval England, fashion wasn't an act of rebellion, far from it. It was more like a uniform assigned at birth, a sartorial straitjacket that meticulously announced everything about you, your class, your occupation, your gender, and, perhaps most importantly, whether you were allowed to sit at the high table or fetch water from the nearest muddy ditch. If you were fortunate enough to be born into nobility, congratulations. You got to swan about in layers of silk, brocade, and velvet, so heavy and voluminous they often required a small army of attendants just to help you get dressed each morning, and maybe a quiet prayer or two that you wouldn't faint under the sheer weight and restrictive layers. Colours mattered immensely. Rich, vibrant shades like scarlet, imperial purple, and deep true blue weren't just fashion statements. They were, in essence, medieval do not enter signs, visible declarations of untouchable status. The dyes required to achieve these brilliant hues were so astronomically expensive that only the wealthiest could afford them, making bright, saturated clothing the ultimate, undeniable status symbol. And yes, even your belt had its own reputation. If it was gilded, bejeweled, and entirely unnecessary for holding anything up, it spoke volumes about your lineage. Peasants, on the other hand, had no such luxuries, or indeed any choice in the matter. Their wardrobes were made of coarse, unyielding wool or rough linen, usually in the color of undifferentiated dirt, which conveniently matched both their arduous jobs in the fields and their almost non-existent laundry schedule. A simple tunic and hose for the men, a loose-fitting gown, and perhaps a serviceable apron for the women. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't comfortable, but it got the job done, especially when the job involved mucking out a pigsty or toiling under a hot sun. And just in case someone got ambitious ideas, like a merchant's son daring to wear fur-trimmed sleeves that mimicked those of a lesser noble, there were the sumptuary laws. These royal decrees, often issued by exasperated monarchs, meticulously regulated who could wear what, right down to the precise material, the exact shade of color, and the acceptable trimming. You couldn't just dress up because you wanted to feel nice or express yourself. That was suspicious, possibly treasonous, and the local officials were all too eager to fine you, publicly shame you, or even confiscate your garments for wearing shoes that were too pointy for your class. In the grand, often muddy, theatre of medieval life, fashion wasn't about self-expression. It was about survival, maintaining status, and above all, staying rigorously in your assigned lane. Your clothes spoke volumes before you ever uttered a word. And if they said the wrong thing, someone in authority would remind you very quickly and very publicly just how far down the feudal ladder you actually were. If there's one thing the medieval church, perpetually preoccupied with sin and salvation, really didn't trust, it was a woman's hair. Flowing locks, unbound and shimmering in the sunlight, were considered far too tempting, too suggestive. Loose curls tumbling freely were practically sorcery, beckoning men into unholy thoughts. So, to keep the world safe from lust and the eternal fires of damnation, women, especially married ones, were strongly encouraged, often compelled, to wrap their heads up like freshly baked loaves of bread. Enter the wimple, a head and neck covering that, once donned, made every woman look as though she'd just stepped out of a particularly strict convent or perhaps a very pious lampshade convention. It wrapped around the chin, covered the throat, and often left only the face visible, sometimes not even the ears. Perfect if your primary goal was to resemble a very virtuous, slightly uncomfortable mannequin. For married women and widows, wearing a wimple was not just expected, it was practically mandated attire. Not wearing one, or wearing it improperly, could lead to immediate whispers, raised eyebrows, and, most damningly in medieval terms, being publicly called unchaste, which, you understand, was only slightly better than being labelled a heretic. But the wimple wasn't solely about modesty. It was also a powerful social signal. The fancier, the more elaborate, and the more expensive the wimple, the higher your social status. Rich women had theirs meticulously crafted from fine imported linen or even shimmering silk, often stiffened with starch into rigid, almost architectural shapes that defied gravity and certainly comfort. Some versions were so elaborate they required a complex array of wires and pins to keep them from collapsing like a poorly built tent. Meanwhile, poor women wore simpler versions, made from rougher fabric, that were more about covering lice than inciting envy. Of course, fashion being fashion, the rules inevitably started bending. Some women, subtly at first, let a few strands of hair peek out from beneath their wimples. Others wore transparent veils over their wimples for just a hint of allure, achieving, by medieval standards, scandal levels that were surprisingly mild. By the later Middle Ages, younger, unmarried women were slowly allowed to go bareheaded, or to wear their hair in decorative braids or loose waves, depending entirely on local custom and the strictness of their parish priest. But for most adult women, the wimple remained a daily staple. And in a world where people rarely bathed and lice were more common than spoons, covering your hair wasn't just a religious dictate, it was also remarkably practical. The wimple helped protect your neck from sunburn, your scalp from insects, and apparently your soul from sin. So next time you complain about modern dress codes or a bad hair day, just remember there was once a time when leaving your hair uncovered was enough to get you judged, fined, or possibly even exercised. Let's talk about legs, specifically medieval men's fascinating, almost obsessive compulsion to show them off very, very tightly. While women were diligently bundling themselves in layers of modesty and wimples, men in medieval England were stuffing themselves into hose. Essentially medieval leggings that clung to every contour, leaving little to the imagination and even less to practicality. Originally, hose were two separate tubes of fabric resembling long socks, each tied to a belt around the waist. Because, after all, nothing says fashion-forward like strapping your pants on with string. Over time, those two halves eventually evolved into a single pair of tight-fitting trousers, usually made of wool, sometimes dyed in vibrant, scandalous colors. For the nobility, the colors were bright, the fit was impossibly snug, and the fabrics were exorbitantly expensive. For everyone else, the hose were functional-ish, unless you suddenly needed to run, bend down, or perhaps, most crucially, breathe. But here's where things take an unexpected, almost surreal turn. Enter the codpiece. You might think medieval fashion was all stiff collars, religious gilt, and the clanking of armor, but somewhere along the line, someone looked at the rather vulnerable, exposed area between the tight hose and said, with an air of profound insight, "That needs attention, and a statement." Originally, the codpiece was simply a modest flap of fabric designed to bridge the gap and provide some very minimal coverage. But by the 15th century, it had evolved into a full-blown fashion statement, stuffed, padded, sometimes even jeweled. Because apparently, no matter the era, men will always find a way to turn pants into a peacocking contest. The codpiece also had a practical function, it must be admitted. Let's say you're a knight, clad in heavy, cumbersome armor, caught in the midst of war, and suddenly nature calls. That little flap, easily unfastened, very handy. But fashion, being the untamed beast it is, ran with it. Some codpieces were shaped like small decorative purses. Others were large enough to store a dagger or perhaps some spare coins, which is either remarkably resourceful or completely unhinged. As with most outrageous trends, sumptuary laws eventually stepped in to declare, that's enough. No more ridiculously oversized or ostentatiously flashy codpieces. Though enforcement, you won't be surprised to learn, was inconsistent at best. By the late 16th century, they mercifully fell out of fashion, replaced by a more modest approach to trousers and, you can almost hear it, a collective sigh of relief from tailors everywhere. If you ever thought medieval England was all mud and misery, all grey skies and solemn prayers, you clearly haven't seen how the nobility dressed for winter or summer or just a casual Tuesday. Because when it came to flaunting wealth, fur and feathers were the medieval equivalent of posting yacht photos on social media, but far more tangible and far less likely to be stolen by a digital algorithm. Let's start with fur. This wasn't just about staying warm, though that was a bonus. It was a full-blown fashion arms race. Ermine, the pristine white fur with black tips, and miniver, a type of grey and white squirrel fur, were the prized pelts of the upper crust. Lining your cloak with fur wasn't just cozy, it was a loud, visible, unmistakable declaration that you, unlike the common folk, did not milk your own cows or plough your own fields. In fact, the rarer the animal, the more important and powerful you appeared. Some lords draped themselves in exotic furs imported from the distant Baltic regions, all while pretending it was just something they happened to have lying around the castle. Feathers were another hot item, not for warmth, but for pure, unadulterated flair. A magnificent plume in the cap signaled immediate status, especially if it was from something exotic and hard to come by, like an ostrich or a peacock. Now, considering there weren't many ostriches running wild around Yorkshire, this was strictly high-end accessorizing. Knights wore them proudly in their gleaming helmets, creating a dramatic silhouette, and courtiers pinned them to their hats with an air of competitive elegance, like they were trying to win the medieval equivalent of a runway challenge. Of course, with all this blatant flaunting, the sumptuary laws, ever vigilant, made another appearance. These laws didn't just regulate fabric and colour, they also strictly limited what animals could legally grace your shoulders. If you were a newly rich merchant who suddenly developed a taste for ermine, you might find yourself summarily fined, publicly shamed, or worse, forcibly defluffed by zealous officials. Only royalty or high-ranking nobles were allowed to swan about in certain furs. Everyone else was supposed to stick to rabbit, sheep, or whatever unfortunate creature died conveniently near the road. And let's not forget the ever-present moral panic. Clergy, perpetually concerned with the state of their parishioners' souls, regularly preached that luxury clothing, especially fur and feathers, led directly to vanity, pride, and presumably the imminent collapse of civilization. But, as usual, those warnings were largely ignored the moment someone caught a glimpse of their own magnificent reflection in a polished silver mirror. If you've ever complained about modern fashion being uncomfortable or impractical, allow us to present the poulain, a medieval shoe so impossibly long and pointed it could have doubled as a weapon, a makeshift compass, or perhaps a very peculiar divining rod. Before the poulain madness took over, shoes in medieval England were relatively simple, functional affairs. The average person wore turn shoes, soft leather footwear stitched inside out and then flipped right side out for durability and comfort. Functional, flexible, and about as stylish as a sack of potatoes, these were perfectly fine for a life of farming, hauling goods, and praying not to catch leprosy. But in courtly circles, among the fashion-conscious nobility, things took a decidedly weird turn. Around the 14th century, nobles collectively decided that the most fashionable shoe was the one that extended absurdly far beyond your actual toes. We're talking anywhere from 6 to 24 inches of pure, unadulterated, pointless toe extension. These were the poulains, named somewhat unfairly after Poland, which medieval fashionistas apparently blamed for the bizarre trend. The elongated tips were often stuffed with moss, straw, or even whalebone to keep them rigidly erect. Because nothing, absolutely nothing, says elegance quite like tripping over your own feet in front of the king. Naturally, the longer your shoe, the higher your status. Why? Because no one engaged in actual physical labor, no farmer, no blacksmith, no soldier, could possibly walk, much less work, around with clown-length footwear. These shoes practically screamed, "I don't need to run, fight, or even survive. I'm rich, and therefore profoundly impractical." Some even had tiny bells attached to the tips, just in case your absurdity wasn't audibly evident enough. As expected, the ever-vigilant church was appalled. Preachers condemned polaines as sinful, vain, and a sure sign of moral decay. The government, perpetually concerned with social order, agreed, and sumptuary laws were quickly passed to restrict their length, particularly for the middle class who were beginning to adopt the style, much to the aristocracy's annoyance. But like all banned fashion, the more people were told no, the more they defiantly pointed their shoes at the heavens and declared, "Watch me." Eventually, the trend, like most impractical footwear, mercifully went out of style. People remembered they had to walk places and possibly fight and perhaps climb stairs without impaling themselves. But for a glorious, utterly ridiculous moment in fashion history, pointy shoes ruled the land. And while no one can quite explain why people wanted their toes to look like fencing swords, it's comforting to know that fashion has always involved a healthy dose of delusion. We often think of armor as purely practical gear, something designed solely to stop arrows, deflect swords, and help you survive a Tuesday afternoon battle against your sworn enemies. But in medieval England, armor wasn't just about grim protection, it was also a high fashion statement.
And yes, knights, those chivalrous warriors, cared deeply about their drip, their appearance. A basic suit of armor, good. A custom-engraved, intricately gilded set with fluted breastplates and polished elbow guards that could blind an enemy or a monk at 50 paces, even better. For the upper crust of chivalry, armor was meticulously tailored like a Savile Row suit. Artisans spent weeks, sometimes months, painstakingly crafting pieces that were not only functionally protective, but undeniably fabulous. Because if you were going to die in battle, you might as well look stunning doing it. And let's not forget heraldry. Shields and surcoats bore bold colors and elaborate family crests, snarling lions, fearsome dragons, flirtatiously aggressive birds. These weren't just identifiers in the chaos of war, they were branding, pure and simple. Knights were the influencers of their day, and a well-designed, recognizable coat of arms was your personal logo, shouted across the battlefield. Tournaments, far from being mere martial exercises, became the medieval runway. Nobles would parade their finest, most ostentatious suits of plate or chainmail, complete with majestically plumed helmets and surcoats designed to literally blind a monk at 50 paces with their shimmering embroidery. Fashion even crept into weaponry. Daggers were often jewel-encrusted, their hilts sparkling with precious stones. Sword hilts were inlaid with silver or gold, etched with intricate patterns. Some even bore inscriptions, not for any functional purpose, but simply to remind your enemy just how incredibly rich you were as you stabbed them. Pure class. Of course, peasants and foot soldiers had no such luxury. Their armor was, to put it mildly, iffy. Maybe a dented helmet, a rusted chain shirt inherited from 3 battles ago, and a quiet prayer whispered skyward. But for those with coin and status, armor became another medium for self-expression, a way to project power and personal brand.
If your enemy hesitated, even for a split second, because they were too busy admiring the intricate engraving on your breastplate, well, that was just good strategy. Eventually, as firearms emerged and warfare changed, full suits of armor became largely obsolete. But for a few glorious centuries, fashion and warfare danced hand in gauntleted hand. And in medieval England, the battlefield was just another place to serve looks. Not everyone in medieval England was a valiant knight or a noble lady. Some were children, others were monks, and many dressed not to impress, but to send a very specific message. Usually something along the lines of, "I belong to God," or, more urgently, "Please don't throw me in a ditch." Let's start with children. Medieval kids weren't dressing in adorable tiny outfits with teddy bear patterns or whimsical designs. They were, quite literally, miniature adults. Boys wore tunics just like their fathers, scaled down, and girls were dressed in long gowns just like their mothers, minus the expensive fur and intricate embroidery. There was little concept of childhood as a unique stage of life. You got swaddled, you got baptized, and before you knew it, you were being put in scratchy wool and expected to know your Latin. Comfort was entirely optional. Now on to the clergy, who, despite all the talk of modesty and humility, could still put on quite a show. Bishops and abbots, high-ranking church officials, often wore richly dyed robes, intricately embroidered stoles, and elaborate mitres that looked like magnificent upside-down boats perched precariously on their heads. Gold thread, fine linen, and jewelled crosses made them stand out dramatically from the crowd, which was probably the entire point. While priests lower down the ladder wore more austere garments, simple black cassocks or rough brown robes, higher-ranking church officials were practically walking relics, adorned with the wealth of the church. But clothing for clergy wasn't about personal taste. It was about profound symbolism. Every color, every layer, every accessory had a precise meaning. Purple for penance, white for purity, red for martyrdom, because nothing, apparently, says spiritual devotion like coordinating your outfit with the blood of saints. And then there were those in specific religious orders, like monks and nuns. Their habits were the medieval equivalent of uniforms, practical, consistent, and intentionally drab. The idea was to eliminate vanity and focus solely on the soul. But even here you had subtle fashion politics. A Benedictine habit wasn't the same as a Franciscan one. Some orders favored voluminous hoods. Others banned shoes entirely, requiring their members to go barefoot. In essence, your robe told the world which holy club you belonged to, and whether you were the type to chant at sunrise or just silently judge others. So whether you were a barefoot novice, a jewel-bedecked bishop, or a 9-year-old peasant already dressed for a lifetime of labor, your clothing in medieval England didn't just cover your body. It revealed your precise role, your values, and the very limited range of your choices. If medieval England had one unspoken rule, it was this: stay in your sartorial lane. And if you didn't, if you dared to dress above your station, the crown was ready with a tidy little tool called the sumptuary law, a royal decree that basically said, "Nice shoes. Too bad they're illegal for your class." These laws weren't subtle suggestions. They meticulously dictated who could wear what, in what color, with what material, and even how wide your sleeves could be. That's right, sleeve width was legislated. You could literally measure someone's legal status by how far their elbows flared. If your sleeves looked like sails and you weren't a duke, congratulations, you were breaking the law and there would be consequences. The original purpose of these laws was simple: to keep the class structure visibly, undeniably stratified. The elites wanted to make absolutely certain that no ambitious merchant or newly rich knight started dressing like nobility. Heaven forbid someone without a title might dare to wear scarlet silk lined with ermine and confuse the peasants. These rules applied to everything imaginable: shoes, hats, embroidery, jewelry, fur linings, even buttons. Buttons. If you were wearing too many, or if they were too ornate for your station, you might very well get fined. In some towns, officials would literally walk the streets, meticulously inspecting people's outfits. It was less fashion police and more actual police, with real fines and public shaming. Of course, enforcement was predictably inconsistent. Some laws were passed and promptly ignored, while others were taken deadly seriously. One tailor's apprentice was famously jailed for wearing a silver-buckled belt reserved only for minor gentry. His defense: "It was a gift from my uncle." The judge, you can imagine, was not impressed. But here's the irony. The more the laws tried to restrict fashion, the more obsessed people became with pushing the limits. Loopholes were invented. Tailors got incredibly creative. A banned fabric? No problem. Just dye a legal one to resemble it. Forbidden furs? Hide them subtly in the lining. Sumptuary laws tried to keep society neat, tidy, and visually stratified. But fashion, being the chaotic, rebellious little beast it is, flatly refused to play along. People found ways to signal status even without overtly breaking the rules. Through subtler cuts, regional trends, or just sheer audacious confidence. Because in medieval England, dressing above your station wasn't just a style choice, it was a rebellion wrapped in velvet, and sometimes sewn shut with gold thread. Medieval fashion may seem like a far-off curiosity, something best left to tapestry reenactors and Renaissance fair vendors, but its influence still lingers in ways that are sneakier than a monk's vow of silence. For starters, the medieval obsession with clothing as identity is still very much alive today. We might swap ermine-lined cloaks for tailored suits or designer logos, but the underlying idea remains. We dress to be seen, to belong, or to subtly or not so subtly show off. That deep-seated instinct to communicate power, piety, or rebellion through fashion, the Middle Ages had it down centuries before Instagram ever got the memo. Take academic robes, for example. That billowing black gown you wear at graduation, the one that feels surprisingly warm in July. That's straight out of a medieval university, where scholars dressed much like monks, because in many cases they were monks. Those long hoods, tassels, and color-coded stripes all descend directly from clerical dress codes, just modernized slightly to make you look scholarly, without, thankfully, making you take a vow of poverty. Even today's ubiquitous wedding dresses, those flowing white gowns that look straight out of a fairy tale, have roots in medieval ceremonial wear. Back then, brides often wore their very best gown, whatever color that happened to be. But among the elite, weddings quickly became prime opportunities to showcase immense wealth. Gold-threaded veils, impossibly rare imported fabrics, and extravagant headdresses turned a simple marriage ceremony into a couture event. And let's not forget the lingering romanticism of the period. Writers, painters, and filmmakers have long mined the medieval wardrobe for inspiration. From King Arthur films to sweeping fantasy series like Game of Thrones, the look of medieval England remains fashion shorthand for nobility, mystique, and vaguely ominous chanting. Of course, not everything stuck. We don't line our sleeves with squirrel anymore, usually. And codpieces have thankfully retired from public life, but the spirit remains. Clothes as a declaration, a performance, a soft, subtle kind of power. In the end, fashion in medieval England was about more than just covering the body. It was about revealing the soul, your rank, and just how close to royalty you could pretend to be without getting fined. Chapter 6. Ancient Egyptian Beauty, Rituals of Life. In ancient Egypt, beauty wasn't merely a matter of vanity or personal preference. Oh no, it was a profound theology with a compact mirror.
Looking good wasn't just a suggestion, it was expected, almost mandated. The gods, in their eternal perfection, were beautiful, radiant, eternally youthful, and flawlessly symmetrical. And if you, a mere mortal, wanted any chance of winning their divine favor, if you wished for a prosperous life and a blessed afterlife, you had better look the part. Pimples were most certainly not divine. Neither were wrinkles nor body odor. From the bustling, sun-baked markets of Thebes to the quiet, sacred tombs along the fertile banks of the Nile, beauty was inextricably baked in to the very fabric of daily life. This wasn't just a concern for queens and courtiers. Every single person, from high priests performing sacred rituals to the most humble housemaids preparing meals, took part in the almost ritualistic dedication to self-maintenance. Being meticulously well-groomed signaled that you were clean, disciplined, and, crucially, spiritually aligned with the cosmic order. Translation: if you didn't exfoliate, the gods might, quite literally, think you were lazy and unworthy of their blessings. Cosmetics were considered holy tools, not just for earthly seduction, but for profound spiritual protection. There was no real divide between beauty and religion in ancient Egypt. Both were interwoven, part of the same sacred script. Temples meticulously stored jars of scented oils and fragrant balms just as carefully as they stored precious sacred scrolls. Perfume was not merely an adornment, it was an integral part of worship, used in offerings and anointing rituals. And kohl eyeliner, that iconic jet-black line you see in every depiction, wasn't just stylish. It served practical purposes, protecting the wearer from the sun's harsh glare, and, equally important, warding off malevolent evil spirits. And yes, even in the afterlife, where judgment awaited, you were expected to arrive looking fresh, radiant, and perfectly prepared. That's precisely why tombs were so often filled with elaborate beauty kits, because nobody, absolutely nobody, wants to arrive in the underworld looking tired or disheveled. Priests in particular were held to astonishingly rigid grooming standards. They shaved their entire bodies, head, face, and all, wore only clean linen garments, and applied generous amounts of scented oils before any ritual. Why such extreme measures? Because they were literally standing in for the gods themselves, acting as their earthly conduits. You simply do not show up to a divine ceremony smelling like yesterday's goat stew or with unruly body hair. But it wasn't all holiness and hygiene. Beauty also possessed a sharp, undeniable political edge. Pharaohs masterfully used their appearance to project an image of divine power, their perfectly sculpted faces and regal bearing reinforcing their godlike status. Queens like Nefertiti became living embodiments of idealized beauty, not just through exquisite art, but through their meticulously maintained appearances. Being beautiful was being powerful, and being powerful in ancient Egypt often meant looking like you hadn't aged a single day since birth. In short, ancient Egyptian beauty was less about fleeting trends and more about eternal truths, cosmic alignment, and profound spiritual connection. It wasn't about impressing your date. It was about aligning your mortal body with the very order of the universe. And if that meant slathering yourself in perfumed oil and lining your eyes with ground-up minerals, then so be it. You may think smoky eyeliner is a modern invention, a recent trend popularized by glamorous celebrities and social media tutorials. But ancient Egyptians had it mastered over 4,000 years ago. And they certainly didn't need a YouTube tutorial to achieve that iconic look.
The instantly recognizable jet-black lines seen on countless statues, elaborate murals, and preserved mummies weren't just for dramatic effect or aesthetic appeal. That deep, dark pigment, it was coal, and it was ubiquitous. Men, women, and even children wore it, not because they all secretly aspired to be Cleopatra, but because coal possessed serious multitasking powers that blended practicality with profound spirituality. First and foremost, it was remarkably practical. The Egyptian sun, relentless and unforgiving, didn't play around, and the dark pigment helped significantly reduce glare, acting as a natural sun shield for the eyes. Think of it as the original organic sunglasses in paste form. Made primarily from galena, a mineral rich in lead sulfide, coal also had surprisingly effective antibacterial properties. Modern science, in a fascinating twist, actually backs this up. Studies have shown that trace amounts of lead in the galena could stimulate the body's immune response, helping prevent prevalent eye infections in the dusty, arid climate. In short, it looked good and, quite remarkably, it worked. But in true Egyptian fashion, there was always more going on than meets the eye, quite literally. Coal held significant spiritual importance too. It was widely believed to offer powerful protection against the evil eye, a malevolent curse delivered through a dirty look or envious glance. Lining your eyes wasn't just stylish, it was a form of spiritual armor, a visible ward against unseen dangers. Children, particularly vulnerable, were often marked with exaggerated eyeliner for extra protection, especially during boisterous festivals or long-distance travel. Application was an art form in itself. Coal came in decorative containers, often exquisitely carved, and applicators ranged from simple sticks to ornate ones made of polished bone or gleaming metal. You would dip the stick into the powdered coal, moisten it slightly with a touch of saliva or a drop of oil, and then carefully, meticulously apply the mixture to both the upper and lower eyelids, often extending into a dramatic wing. Ancient eye makeup, you realize, was 50% glamour and 50% spiritual warfare preparation. And Egyptians were certainly not subtle about it. The eyes were elongated and exaggerated to mirror the Eye of Horus, a powerful symbol of divine protection, healing, and royal power. So even if you didn't own vast tracts of land or a retinue of servants, your eyeliner could still loudly proclaim, "I'm channeling divine energy, back off." If the eyes were outlined with coal to invoke the gods and ward off evil, then the cheeks and lips were painted to create an appearance that suggested you were not just favored by the gods, but actively blessed by them. Ancient Egyptians didn't shy away from vibrant color, especially not red. And their go-to beauty product for this effect was a bold, earthy pigment called red ochre. Red ochre was meticulously ground from naturally occurring iron-rich clay, a material abundant in the Nile Valley, and then mixed with a base of animal fat, gum, or resin to create a smooth, workable paste. The result was a vibrant, striking crimson tint that could be applied generously to both lips and cheeks. Think of it as the original multi-purpose stick, part lipstick, part blush, all dramatic statement. Now, why red? In Egyptian symbolism, red was a powerful color, representing life, vitality, passion, and energy. It was everything a healthy, beautiful, and thriving person should exude. While pale skin might have been fashionable in later centuries and other cultures, in ancient Egypt a healthy, sun-kissed color meant strength, vitality, and a connection to the life-giving sun. A bit of crimson on your face boldly told the world, "I'm alive, desirable, and very likely favored by the gods."
And this wasn't limited to women. Men, especially those of noble or royal rank, used red ochre as well. Pharaohs, high priests, and elite partygoers would confidently show up to ceremonies and banquets with perfectly tinted lips and rouged cheeks. In fact, art from the New Kingdom often depicts both genders with that signature reddish pout, a clear indication of status and health. If you were wealthy and respected, you were rosy. If not, you probably blended into the sand. Application wasn't subtle either. There was no delicate blending, no intricate contouring, no whispered nudges towards nude tones here. Egyptians believed in bold visibility. If you were making offerings to the gods or simply showing up to a dinner party, your face needed to pop, to make an undeniable statement. For special occasions, the red pigment might even be layered for intense saturation, or mixed with a touch of shimmering gold dust for extra divine flair. Of course, not all cosmetic concoctions were entirely safe. Some poorer quality rouges, made with less refined ingredients, contained substances that were harsh or even toxic, especially for those who couldn't afford the high-end imports. But beauty in ancient Egypt was often considered worth the risk, for looking radiant was inextricably tied to status, perceived health, and even your chances of a pleasant afterlife. Ancient Egyptians didn't just want to look divine, they wanted to smell like it too.
And in a world where the sun relentlessly baked everything, where daily showers weren't exactly a commonplace thing, fragrance became both an undeniable luxury and a profound necessity. Enter perfumed wax cones and aromatic wigs, two of the most delightfully bizarre yet utterly fascinating inventions in ancient beauty history. Let's start with the cones. These weren't just decorative hats or whimsical adornments. They were carefully crafted cones made of scented animal fat or beeswax, meticulously mixed with precious essential oils. Lotus, myrrh, frankincense, and cinnamon were common, highly prized favorites, lending an exotic, sacred aroma. During festivals, lavish feasts, or solemn religious ceremonies, guests would place these cones directly on top of their heads. Over the course of the evening, the warmth of the body and the ambient heat of the room would slowly melt the wax, gradually releasing its potent perfume in a continuous, gentle stream down the wearer's hair and clothing. Picture a slow-dripping, natural air freshener, but infinitely more chic and ancient. Now, before you worry about greasy hair, rest assured, no one simply slapped a lump of melting wax onto their bare scalp. Most Egyptians, particularly those of the elite class, meticulously shaved their heads. This was done not just for cleanliness and comfort in the scorching heat, but also to allow for the wearing of finely made wigs. These wigs, more than just fashion accessories, acted as both profound status symbols and practical platforms for the melting cones. These wigs were not your average Halloween costume variety. They were masterpieces, meticulously crafted from human hair or plant fibers, intricately braided, curled, and styled to show off immense wealth and sophisticated taste. Wigs were so vitally important that many tombs included at least one in the burial goods, ensuring the deceased had a good scent and a solid hairdo to face the gods in the afterlife. Some wigs were even perfumed directly, soaked or dusted with aromatic powders, transforming the wearer into a walking bouquet of sanctity and opulent fragrance. Fragrance wasn't just for the living either. Mummies were ceremonially anointed with precious oils and resins, and tombs were often filled with jars of perfume, because in the afterlife, smelling divine was still very much on the checklist. Being foul-smelling wasn't just unpleasant, it was considered unholy, a sign of impurity and disorder. A clean, sweet scent symbolized purity, life, and profound divine favor, a direct link to the gods themselves. Living in Egypt meant one thing was guaranteed: sun. Relentless, baking, unforgiving sun that beat down from a clear, cloudless sky day after day. And while modern folks might reach for SPF 50 and complain about the oppressive humidity, the ancient Egyptians had their own, surprisingly advanced and remarkably holistic approach to skincare. One that seamlessly blended practical science, ritualistic belief, and a whole lot of precious oil. Let's start with the basics: daily cleansing. Egyptians, you might be surprised to learn, bathed far more frequently and meticulously than most other ancient cultures. Cleanliness wasn't just about comfort, it was deeply tied to spirituality. Dirt was considered disorder. Filth, it was believed, attracted demons and ill fortune. So everyone, from the highest-ranking priests to the most humble peasants, tried to stay scrubbed clean, often using a paste made from natron, a naturally occurring salt mixture, and water. Think of it as the original exfoliating scrub, a potent blend of chemical cleansing power strong enough to preserve mummies. But the real heart of Egyptian skincare was moisturizing, and they didn't skimp. The dry desert air, the intense heat, and the constant wind made skin maintenance absolutely essential to prevent premature aging and dehydration. Enter a rich array of oils: moringa oil, castor oil, sesame oil, olive oil, and various animal fats. These precious concoctions were applied liberally to the skin, not just to protect against sun damage and lock in hydration, but to maintain a youthful, almost radiant glow that even Hathor, the goddess of beauty, would envy. They also dabbled, quite surprisingly, in anti-aging solutions. Yes, really. Recipes painstakingly transcribed on papyrus scrolls mentioned intricate mixtures of milk, honey, and frankincense, each ingredient chosen for its known antibacterial or soothing properties. Almond oil was popular for reducing wrinkles, and fenugreek was used to keep skin smooth and supple. Cleopatra herself, the legendary queen, was rumored to bathe in sour milk for its lactic acid content. A little pungent perhaps, but hey, it's chemistry, and it clearly worked for her. Skincare wasn't just for beauty though, it was inextricably linked with medicine. Wounds were treated with honey for its remarkable healing properties. Acne was soothed with crushed lotus flowers or barley. Rashes and burns were treated with aloe vera, which was already a known remedy in their sophisticated toolkit. Many of these ancient remedies, you'll note, still show up in modern skincare products today, minus, thankfully, the occasional crocodile fat and the less charming crushed beetle. Even the dead, in the ultimate act of beauty devotion, received spa treatment. During mummification, the body was meticulously coated in oils and wrapped in linen soaked with balms and resins. Eternal youth was the ultimate goal, even if it was mostly symbolic. For ancient Egyptians, body hair was simply not a vibe. In fact, smooth, hairless skin was the gold standard of beauty, hygiene, and even morality. Hair was seen as messy, impure, and perhaps worst of all, foreign, a sign of the uncivilized. To be truly civilized, you had to be sleek, clean, and utterly hairless. Think dolphin, not woolly mammoth. This cultural obsession with hairlessness went far beyond the face. Full-body hair removal was the norm for men and women alike, from meticulously shaped eyebrows to completely hairless ankles. Even priests and high officials were expected to keep themselves painstakingly shaved, because when you're performing sacred rites in front of the gods, the last thing you want is armpit stubble. So how did they achieve this pervasive hairlessness? Razors, for starters, were common, made from copper or bronze. Early Egyptian razors were often shaped like small crescent moons. They were sharp-ish, effective-ish, and came with a high risk of nicks if you weren't incredibly careful. Shaving was a regular, almost daily part of the grooming routine, not a once-a-week chore. But for those who couldn't or wouldn't shave daily, there were alternative methods. Sugaring, for example, was basically ancient waxing. A paste made of honey, sugar, and lemon juice was heated, applied to the skin, and then ripped off with a strip of linen. Sound familiar? That's because modern sugaring salons are still doing it exactly the same way. Egyptians were the blueprint. They also used pumice stones for exfoliation, plucking tools like tweezers, and even depilatory creams made from wild plants and, less charmingly, certain animal parts. Some recipes involved applying a paste of crushed animal bones and lye, followed presumably by fervent prayers to avoid third-degree burns. The price of beauty, you realize, was steep, but apparently entirely worth it. Hairlessness wasn't just aesthetic, it was profoundly spiritual. Removing body hair symbolized purification, a cleansing of the self. Being smooth meant being clean, civilized, and blessed by the gods. Hair, by contrast, was associated with the wild, the foreign, the animalistic. It's no accident that enemies in Egyptian art were often depicted with scruffy beards and unkempt manes, symbols of their untamed, uncivilized nature.
Wigs helped complete the look. Since most elites shaved their heads for comfort and hygiene in the scorching climate, wigs provided the perfect solution for style without the sweat or the bother of growing natural hair. You could be completely bald underneath and still confidently rock intricate braids, delicate beads, and fragrant perfume cones on top. Ancient Egyptian beauty products weren't just cosmetic. They were potent, transformative elixirs in a jar. Every oil, every paste, every fragrant resin carried a deeper meaning. For Egyptians, ingredients weren't chosen just for how they made you look, but for what they profoundly represented, and, occasionally, for how well they scared off pesky skin infections and malevolent evil spirits. Let's start with the all-stars, the heavy hitters. Frankincense and myrrh weren't just for sacred ceremonies or future biblical cameos. Oh no, they were skin saviors, invaluable beauty mainstays. Frankincense was burned for its aromatic smoke, meticulously ground into powder for purifying masks, or mixed with precious oils to rejuvenate and refresh the skin. Myrrh, a sticky golden resin, had remarkable antiseptic properties and was widely used to treat wounds, soothe wrinkles, and even embalm the dead. In other words, it was anti-aging to the extreme, extending its benefits even beyond the grave. Then there was honey, a natural moisturizer, an antibacterial miracle, and an all-around MVP of the ancient beauty world. It was mixed into masks for hydration, applied directly to acne for its healing properties, or layered over chapped lips for soothing relief. Want softer, more supple skin? Try a mask of honey, milk, and crushed lotus petals. Want divine favor? Add a chant while applying. Egyptian skincare seamlessly blended practical natural science with profound ritual magic. Many cosmetic recipes were painstakingly written on papyrus scrolls, often alongside detailed medical treatments and powerful spells.
A facial cream, for instance, might include aloe vera, cucumber, and a line like, "to make the skin of the face shine like the moon." Bonus points if the moon god Thoth approved of your application. Some ingredients, however, wandered into decidedly questionable territory. Crocodile dung, for instance, was believed to ward off evil and was sometimes, disturbingly, included in skin salves. Yes, it was gross. But in a world where spiritual protection mattered as much as physical health, even a swampy smear was considered fair game in the pursuit of beauty and divine favor. There were also love potions disguised as perfumes, anti-aging balms whispered over by priestesses, and makeup formulas passed down through generations, each with its own mystical lore. Beauty was chemistry, yes, but it was also profound ceremony, a daily ritual that blended aesthetics with potent divine energy. These sacred mixtures weren't just about looking good, they were about aligning yourself with cosmic forces, keeping your body, your spirit, and your reflection in perfect harmony with the gods. It was skincare meets spirituality, with a touch of drama and perhaps a bit too much Galena. When we think of ancient Egypt, our minds immediately conjure images of towering pyramids, magnificent pharaohs, and grand temples. But behind the scenes, far from the monumental structures, a booming, sophisticated beauty industry was quietly, yet powerfully at work. And no, this wasn't just a few villagers trading homemade face masks at the local market. This was a full-scale economy, a complex commercial enterprise built entirely around the trade of precious oils, exotic perfumes, vibrant pigments, intricate grooming tools, and the eternal, insatiable quest to look like you had direct divine ancestry. Merchants along the life-giving Nile specialized in cosmetics, selling everything from perfumed balms in delicate jars to vast quantities of kohl and red ochre. These weren't just simple homemade mixtures either. Many ingredients were specifically imported from distant lands: frankincense from the mysterious land of Punt, myrrh from Nubia, and exotic oils from across the vast Mediterranean. If you had money, if you possessed wealth and status, you had access to the ancient world's most luxurious and potent beauty products. And if you didn't, you probably just crushed some local herbs and hoped for the best. Cosmetic jars and vessels were in themselves exquisite art forms. Rich Egyptians stored their precious makeup in elegant alabaster containers, intricately carved ivory boxes, or fanciful pots shaped like deities or graceful lotus flowers. Having beautiful packaging wasn't just a flex, a display of wealth, it was an integral part of the ritual, elevating the act of applying makeup to a sacred experience. You didn't just slap on eyeliner from a crude clay pot, you honored your face with a touch from a hand-carved cosmetic spoon shaped like a swimming girl or a gazelle, transforming a mundane act into a moment of reverence. There were even professional beauticians. Yes, ancient glam squads. Elite women had dedicated servants trained in the intricate arts of grooming, perfuming, hair maintenance, and cosmetics. These attendants weren't just applying lipstick, they were meticulously upholding a sacred standard of appearance, ensuring their mistress was always camera-ready for the gods. Priests had their own rigorous grooming regimens too, often maintained by temple workers, because even communing with the gods required a smooth chin and a well-oiled scalp. And let's not forget the profound role of beauty in death. Tombs of the wealthy often contained full grooming kits, ensuring that the deceased could continue their skincare routine in the afterlife. It wasn't just about vanity, it was about arriving before the gods looking fresh, fragrant, and fully moisturized, prepared for eternity. In short, the ancient Egyptian beauty industry wasn't a side hustle. It was a foundational pillar of society, inextricably woven into religion, status, trade, and daily life. Looking divine wasn't optional, it was an enterprise, and business, quite literally, was eternal. Chapter 7.
the Vestal virgins, sacred service and ultimate price. She didn't volunteer. No one truly volunteered for the calling of a Vestal virgin. It wasn't about personal passion or a sudden surge of individual devotion. It was about being born into the right family, with the right physical attributes, at precisely the right time. Somewhere between the tender ages of 6 and 10, a Roman girl could suddenly find herself torn from the warmth of her parents' embrace, meticulously placed in ceremonial white garments, and told that she now belonged entirely to the goddess Vesta. The selection process was brutal in its perfectionism. Candidates had to be freeborn, meaning not enslaved. They had to be physically flawless, without any discernible blemish or physical defect. And crucially, they had to be the daughter of 2 living parents who were themselves in good social standing, untouched by scandal. If your father had ever sold fish in the market, or your mother once sneezed during a sacred ritual, you could forget it. Rome demanded girls who were pure, not just in body, but in bloodline and household reputation, pristine in every aspect. The choosing took place under the watchful, solemn gaze of the Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of Rome. He would publicly touch the chosen girl, his hand a symbolic gesture, declaring her captured, an ancient ritual echoing the spoils of wartime conquest. In that profound, life-altering moment, her legal identity shifted entirely. Her father no longer held authority over her. She became, irrevocably, property of the state, sworn to 30 years of sacred service in the temple of Vesta.
Imagine the profound confusion of a 9-year-old girl, plucked from the familiar warmth of her mother's arms, placed within a cold, marble sanctum where silence was sacred, and mistakes could bring not just disapproval, but divine wrath upon an entire city. Her long childhood hair was ceremonially cut, her simple tunic exchanged for the heavy, symbolic white gown of a Vestal, and her very name, her individual identity, seemed to be forgotten, or at least set aside. She would no longer be herself. She was now a Vestal, guardian of the eternal flame, a living symbol of Rome's enduring survival. To outsiders, she was revered, almost deified, even envied for her unique status. Vestals were considered above the law, could own property, and walked through the bustling forum accompanied by lictors, the very same bodyguards who flanked powerful senators. But make no mistake, this was a golden cage, a life meticulously shaped not by personal choice, but by rigid, unyielding ritual. Her girlhood ended with a solemn ceremony, and what followed was a life of cloistered privilege, immense responsibility, and a terrifying vow of chastity, so sacred that breaking it meant an unspeakable death. She was chosen to serve the gods, yes, but first she had to leave herself entirely behind. The first time she crossed the polished marble threshold of the house of the Vestals, it must have felt like stepping into another world entirely. Behind her, the familiar echoes of family, the fading warmth of childhood, the very concept of her individual identity. Ahead, an imposing silence, a rigid discipline, and the daunting responsibility of a sacred fire that represented the very heart of Rome. Nestled intimately beside the circular temple of Vesta in the bustling Roman Forum, the house of the Vestals was both a sanctuary of profound peace and a meticulously ordered prison.
Marble columns, gleaming white under the Roman sun, surrounded a serene courtyard filled with the imposing, silent statues of past priestesses. These statues weren't merely decorative, they were constant, tangible reminders. These were the women who had served faithfully, kept their vows meticulously, and earned eternal honor for their devotion. Or, if their statue was conspicuously missing, well, everyone in Rome knew precisely what that meant. The daily life of a young novice began with an exacting regiment of training. The first decade of her 30-year service was dedicated entirely to learning. The countless rituals, the ancient chants, the complex purification rites, and, above all, the exacting, precise care of Vesta's eternal flame. That fire wasn't merely symbolic. It was considered a living, breathing representation of Rome's heartbeat, its very essence. If it went out, even for a moment, people panicked. Wars were thought to be lost. Heads, sometimes literally, rolled, and someone, probably her, the novice, would inevitably take the blame. Discipline was absolute, unwavering. Vestals had to be silent when required, speak only when commanded, and act with flawless, almost superhuman decorum. Even laughter, spontaneous and joyful, was regulated, carefully contained. Novices rose at dawn, bathed in pure spring water, and meticulously dressed in a pristine white linen gown, secured with a band of pure wool, symbolizing their inviolable chastity and purity. A crimson sash, draped elegantly, hinted at their unique sacred status, and their hair, once cut short, was bound in intricate styles, precise and complex, passed down for generations. She lived with 5 other Vestals, each at a different stage of service, creating a quiet hierarchy. There were the elder Vestals, serious, composed, and often frightening in their austere authority. They watched the novices closely, correcting every small error with a sharp word or a look that seemed to cut deeper than any physical lash. But there was privilege, too, immense and undeniable. Vestals were considered untouchable, sacred. Their word could override a man's testimony in court. They traveled through the city with bodyguards, lictors, who cleared their path. If a condemned prisoner on his way to execution passed one on the street and she merely looked at him, he was pardoned instantly. That kind of power, immense and almost divine, was intoxicating, even for a young girl still learning her place. Still, it was a life of profound paradox. Immense honor, balanced precariously with suffocating expectation. For now she was just beginning, learning the intricate language of the gods, mastering the ancient rhythm of ritual, and trying desperately not to trip in her ceremonial sandals. Because in the hallowed world of Vesta, one wrong step, one single mistake, could echo forever, not just for her, but for all of Rome. The eternal flame of Vesta wasn't just a flickering hearth in a temple. It was Rome's very soul, its protection, its prosperity, and its divine legitimacy, all intimately wrapped in one steady, unwavering glow. And it was her paramount job, her sacred duty, to keep that flame alive, always. Every single day, the Vestals took turns, rotating their shifts, tending the sacred fire burning within the circular temple of Vesta, a structure specifically designed to resemble the primitive round huts of early Roman kings. The fire sat precisely in the center, surrounded by walls open to the sky, because even the gods, it seemed, needed proper ventilation. The moment she crossed into that hallowed space, she wasn't a girl anymore. She was a living conduit, a direct line between the bustling city of Rome and the vast, often inscrutable, divine realm. Keeping the flame alive was far more than simply lighting logs and sweeping away ash. It involved an intricate dance of ritual precision. Only certain types of wood were permitted, carefully selected and prepared.
The fire could not be started with common flint or steel. It had to be kindled using ancient, sacred methods, often involving a concave mirror focusing sunlight, meticulously invoking Vesta's direct favor. When it died out, as it sometimes catastrophically did, it was immediately treated as a national crisis of the highest order. The culprit Vestals faced public shame, a brutal lashing with rods, or, far worse, a fate that Rome seldom spoke of. But the flame wasn't just physical, it was deeply symbolic. It represented Rome's eternal continuity, its fundamental civic order, and its profound identity as a chosen city under the direct protection of the gods. If the flame flickered, so too did Rome's collective confidence in itself, a chilling premonition of disaster. Her hands, still small from childhood, would carefully, reverently arrange the kindling, the thin pieces of wood crackling softly as priests chanted ancient invocations nearby, their voices a low drone. Ashes were meticulously gathered and placed in sacred pits beneath the temple, each action deliberate, meaningful. Everything had a profound meaning. Nothing was casual. There were other duties too, equally vital. She helped prepare the sacred salt cakes, the mola salsa, used in all state rituals, ensuring their purity. She guarded important wills, famously Julius Caesar's, a testament to the absolute trust placed in her. She watched over holy objects that no man was permitted to see, including the Palladium, the sacred statue said to guarantee Rome's invincibility. Her life was no longer her own. It was inextricably fused into the very heartbeat of an empire.
And while the forum bustled outside with the noise of merchants haggling, senators debating, and thieves lurking, she moved in another rhythm, one of profound silence, the faint scent of smoke, and sacred, unyielding duty. Passers-by might glimpse her pristine white veil as she passed, always escorted, always untouchable. But within the cool, quiet walls of the temple, beneath the eternal flame, she labored quietly, for a fire that could never die, and a city that, against all odds, refused to fall. For a woman in ancient Rome, life was typically circumscribed, limited. Your autonomy, your choices, your very existence were generally defined by the men in your life. Your father's rule passed seamlessly to your husband's, and your opinions, if you dared to voice them, often died quietly in the private confines of the atrium. Unless, of course, you wore the pristine white veil of a Vestal. Then, suddenly, you became a legal anomaly. A woman who, in many ways, stood above men, a priestess who transcended politics, a living symbol whom no one, absolutely no one, dared to touch. The Vestal virgins occupied a sacred, almost paradoxical gray area in Roman society. Though they were women, they were granted rights and privileges usually reserved only for male citizens. They could own property in their own name, make wills, and even free slaves, an astonishing degree of financial and legal autonomy for a woman of their time. Their testimony in court carried exceptional, almost divine weight, requiring no oath, for Rome simply assumed that Vesta's daughters could not, by their very nature, lie. In public, they were escorted by lictors, the very same officials who flanked powerful magistrates, clearing their path. Even consuls, the highest elected officials in Rome, stepped respectfully aside when a Vestal passed. If her litter moved through the densely packed forum, the crowds instinctively parted, making way. People averted their eyes, not from disrespect, but from a profound reverence, almost a superstitious awe, and a touch from her, whether accidental or deliberate, could pardon a condemned man on the spot, freeing him from execution. She was given the best seats at the theatre. She dined, on occasion, at the emperor's own table.
She sat in the imperial box during the brutal gladiatorial games, flanked by senators who would never dare to address her without formal permission, a distinct mark of their sacred, untouchable status. Her presence alone was considered profoundly auspicious, a good omen, and her appearance was just as symbolic as her actions. The infulla, her sacred headdress, meticulously bound, marked her as consecrated, set apart. The stola, pure white, proclaimed her inviolable chastity. Her shoes, bound in crimson-red leather, were ceremonial, meant for walking paths that no ordinary woman ever would, paths of ritual and sacred duty. Inside her private quarters, within the sprawling house of the Vestals, she lived better than most Roman matrons. The house itself boasted multiple floors, serene gardens, tranquil fountains, and even personal slaves dedicated solely to their care. It was a cloistered life, certainly, but it was far from a deprived one. She was exempt from the conventional burdens of marriage, childbirth, and the perpetual male authority that governed the lives of other Roman women. But there was an undeniable catch, a delicate balance. All of it, the lictors, the land, the untouchable dignity, was balanced precariously on a single, terrifying condition: that she remained pure, not just physically untouched, but untouched in body, in thought, and beyond all suspicion in behavior. Her power was absolute, but so too was the profound fragility of it, because in Rome one whisper of impropriety, one ill-judged glance, could instantly collapse an entire life built on sacred privilege.
The pedestal was high, but the fall, if it came, was catastrophic, final. It began with a vow that could silence rooms, a promise whispered in hushed tones, yet reverberating with the weight of an entire empire. 30 years, an entire lifetime for some, devoted solely to chastity, to meticulous ritual, and to unyielding discipline. Spoken once, the vow was absolutely binding. No loopholes, no second thoughts, no takebacks. From the precise moment she whispered her solemn promise to Vesta, her body and her very will were no longer hers. They belonged to the goddess and to Rome. The structure of the vow was rigid, almost militaristic in its precision. The service was divided into 3 distinct decades, each with its own focus and purpose. The first 10 years were dedicated entirely to learning: how to meticulously tend the flame, how to recite the ancient rites with perfect cadence, how to prepare the sacred meals, and how to behave with the serene stillness of a marble statue. These years were marked by intense instruction, swift correction, and constant, unwavering observation. She was the student, silent, watchful, absorbing every sacred detail. The second decade was for service, for the active performance of her duties. Now a fully trained Vestal, experienced and capable, she was entrusted with the most sacred tasks. She could tend the eternal fire alone, without supervision, oversee complex temple rituals, and even supervise and guide new initiates, passing on her knowledge. She was the flame's guardian and Vesta's direct human representative in the beating heart of Rome. The final 10 years were dedicated to teaching. She became the elder, the wise mentor, passing on the intricate rituals, the profound meanings, and the accumulated wisdom to a new generation of wide-eyed novices. Her voice, once timid and hesitant, now echoed with quiet authority through the cool stone halls of the temple.
This, you realize, was as close as a woman in Rome could come to true leadership without invoking immediate scandal or suspicion. But behind the strict order and the immense prestige was an invisible yet profound strain. 30 years of absolute celibacy.
not just in deed, but in reputation, in every single interaction. A flirtatious glance, an unchaperoned walk, a rumor whispered too loudly in the forum, a chance encounter that could be misinterpreted. Any of these could unravel everything, her entire life's work, and there were, chillingly, no second chances. If she broke her vow, or was even believed to have done so, the punishment was not merely symbolic. It was brutally, irrevocably fatal. Some Vestals, steeped in their duty, bore the immense burden proudly, their devotion unwavering. Others, however, withered under it, the constant scrutiny and the weight of expectation crushing them. But none, absolutely none, could escape it. Their vow was both a magnificent crown, elevating them above all other women, and a relentless collar, locking them into a role more rigid than any marriage. Only after completing all 30 years, unscathed, unblemished, and utterly devoted, was she finally free. Free to marry, to own a house, to re-enter society, though few ever truly did. Most remained alone, known forever as the women who had once been sacred. For 3 decades she belonged to a goddess. After that, the world didn't quite know what to do with her. On the surface, the life of a Vestal virgin was wrapped in an almost ethereal beauty. Ceremonial garb of pristine white, grand marble halls echoing with sacred whispers, incense trailing through the sacred air, a constant aroma of divinity. But beneath that serene veil of divine service lay a world defined just as much by profound fear as by unwavering faith. Rome, a deeply superstitious society, relied absolutely on ritual to maintain cosmic balance.
If the gods were pleased, crops grew bountifully, armies won glorious victories, and the city thrived in peace. If they weren't pleased, well, fires broke out, omens darkened the sky, and devastating disasters inevitably followed. And so, every single ceremony had to be perfect, every word pronounced with absolute precision, every gesture exact to the smallest detail. The Vestals were at the very center of this cosmic contract. A single misstep, a tiny error in ritual, wasn't just embarrassing, it was a sacrilege, a direct insult to the gods. Even high-ranking priests, powerful men themselves, were afraid to offend them, for they represented Vesta, and Vesta was not known for mercy. When a Vestal approached a sacrificial altar, an almost palpable silence fell over the gathered crowds. No one spoke. When she made her solemn offerings, the entire city seemed to pause, holding its breath. It wasn't just respect, it was a deep, pervasive, superstitious awe, the kind reserved for sudden lightning strikes and the pronouncements of oracles. But their presence wasn't always comforting. A Vestal's compassionate gaze could grant mercy to the condemned, but her withdrawal, her silent disapproval, could doom you. The people feared her power because it was pure, divine, and most dangerously, utterly female in a society that meticulously controlled women's roles. She lived outside the normal hierarchy, bound to no man, subordinate to no one but the goddess. In such a society, this radical independence was both deeply admired and profoundly feared. During public ceremonies, especially the Vestalia in June, when the city honored Vesta, citizens flocked to the temple. Bakers unbarred their ovens and brought offerings. Matrons walked barefoot, offering fervent prayers for fertility and the hearth.
And there she stood, central to it all, performing ancient rites passed down for centuries, but always with the terrifying knowledge that any mistake, any missed chant or poorly timed movement could be seen as a dire omen. And omens in Rome always had catastrophic consequences. The weight of this immense responsibility never truly lifted.
Vestals might appear serene, gliding through rituals with an ethereal calm, but underneath was a constant tightrope walk, always under intense public scrutiny. One error could bring not just personal disgrace, but a widespread public sense of doom for the entire city. Their life was not one of quiet meditation. It was high stakes, high visibility, and absolutely no room for error. Because to be a Vestal was to walk the boundary between divine order and human catastrophe, one ceremony at a time. To the Roman mind, few crimes were darker, few offences more terrifying than a Vestalis incesta, a Vestal who had broken her vow of chastity. Her vow of purity wasn't just a personal promise. It was, in the Roman worldview, inextricably woven into the very fate of the city itself. If she broke it, or was even vehemently suspected of breaking it, the punishment wasn't merely severe. It was meticulously designed to terrify, to serve as a chilling warning. The logic was brutally simple. A Vestal's body belonged entirely to Vesta. Violation of that sacred body meant a direct violation of the goddess herself, which in turn meant divine punishment for all of Rome. Earthquakes, devastating plagues, military defeats. Any major disaster could, in hindsight, be conveniently linked to a Vestal's rumored affair. The solution? Purge the offense, appease the wrathful goddess. The accused Vestal was summarily stripped of her sacred garb. The pristine white veil, symbol of her purity, was cruelly removed. The crimson band, signifying her sacred status, was untied. Her body, once untouchable, now became an object of intense scrutiny, searched for any physical signs of guilt, flushed cheeks, trembling hands, averted eyes. Proof was not required. Suspicion, often fueled by political machinations or public anxiety, was frequently enough. And the unspeakable punishment, burial alive. Roman law, in a chilling paradox, forbade the spilling of a Vestal's blood, fearing it would further desecrate the goddess. So they found a loophole. She would be lowered into an underground chamber just outside the city walls, in the Campus Sceleratus, the Field of the Wicked. There, in the silent darkness, she would find a small room containing a simple bed, a dim lamp, and a single loaf of bread. Symbolically, it was not murder. She was given the means to survive. Realistically, it was a slow, agonizing death in utter darkness, alone. The procession to the site was public, solemn, grief-stricken. The condemned Vestal was led through the city in a closed litter, her face hidden from the distraught crowds. Crowds gathered, but no one spoke. It wasn't entertainment, but a profound civic mourning. Rome was cleansing itself, purging a perceived evil. No man, not even the Pontifex Maximus, could be present in the chamber itself. The priest would oversee her descent, then the shaft would be sealed with earth, and he would walk away. There would be no monument, no epitaph, just the chilling, lingering knowledge that one of Vesta's daughters had fallen, and taken a piece of the city's soul with her. And what of the alleged lover? If named, he would be beaten to death publicly, often in the very forum where the Vestals held such power. He got pain, she got silence. In truth, some accused Vestals were likely innocent, victims of political schemes or convenient scapegoats for Rome's misfortunes. But once accused, there was no defense, no appeal. Because in the eyes of Rome, when a Vestal broke her vow, she wasn't just betraying the gods. She was betraying Rome itself, inviting disaster upon its people. If she made it through all 30 years unscathed, unblemished, and utterly devoted, then and only then was she finally released.
the vow fulfilled, the eternal flame meticulously tended, the sacred rituals passed on to a new generation. She was no longer a Vestal virgin. She was something else entirely, a woman reborn, with a freedom few Roman women ever knew. Liberation came with a quiet ceremony. The Pontifex Maximus formally released her from her sacred obligations, and for the first time in 3 decades, she was genuinely free to choose her own life. She could marry. She could live alone, independently. She could own property and act as a full legal agent, truly free from the perpetual guardianship that most Roman women never escaped. But freedom after such an extraordinarily cloistered life was complex, often disorienting. Most of Rome still saw her as half divine, half ghost, an ethereal being who had lived apart from normal society for decades. No one had courted her. No one had seen her dance or flirt or laugh in the streets in the way other young women did. Many men were wary of marrying a former Vestal. Some believed it would bring bad luck, a lingering curse. Others, intimidated by her immense former authority and the aura of sanctity that still clung to her, simply avoided her. And yet there were those who saw such a union as an extraordinary honor, especially ambitious men hoping to bask in her reflected sanctity. Marrying a former Vestal was like shaking hands directly with the gods. She brought status, wealth, and a name that Rome would never forget. But for the Vestal herself, adapting to life beyond the cloistered temple could feel profoundly disorienting. She had spent her entire girlhood in sacred service, her young adulthood in disciplined silence, her prime years in unwavering sacred duty. Now she entered a society that largely prized women for their families, their children, and their domestic roles, not for their ancient rituals. Some former Vestals chose to marry late in life, finding quiet companionship. Others never did, remaining alone, forever set apart. A few went on to advise emperors or manage vast estates with more influence than any senator's wife, their quiet authority undiminished. They wore veils of a different kind now, ones woven from reputation, from mystery, and from the faint, undeniable aura of divinity that never quite left them. Because even out of service, a former Vestal never truly escaped her past. People still stepped aside for her in the streets. They still whispered her name with profound reverence. She might walk freely now, but she carried 30 years of fire within her, and Rome never, ever forgot who once kept its flame alive. The flame of Vesta was finally extinguished in the 4th century CE, snuffed out not by wind or carelessness, but by empire-wide seismic change. As Christianity spread its influence across the Roman Empire and the old pagan gods slowly faded from public worship, Rome's ancient sacred fires were allowed to go cold, one by one. The Temple of Vesta, once the vibrant, beating heart of the Roman world, was left to crumble, its sacred purpose lost. And with it, the extraordinary order of the Vestal Virgins, guardians of that flame, disappeared from history. But their legacy didn't. For over 1,000 years, from the legendary founding of Rome to its twilight, the Vestals had stood profoundly apart. In a society where women were overwhelmingly expected to serve quietly behind closed doors, to be defined by their male relatives, these women lived publicly, wielded genuine authority, and were bound only to a goddess, to a divine will. They walked where men often feared to tread, delivered testimony without swearing oaths, and held the very fate of the city, symbolically and spiritually, in their careful, consecrated hands.
The radical idea of a woman being both sacred and powerful, not because of a man, but in spite of him, was revolutionary for its time, and it stuck, leaving an indelible mark on subsequent cultures. Later cultures and thinkers, even those far removed from pagan Rome, looked back on the Vestals with enduring fascination. Christian nuns, for instance, inherited much of the same structure from their pagan predecessors: vows of chastity, cloistered lives, symbolic garb, and rigorous sacred rituals. But the spark, the original profound model, was Roman, even centuries after the last Vestal flame flickered out. The image of the Vestal lingered powerfully in art, in literature, and in political rhetoric throughout the ages. Poets invoked her as a symbol of purity and strength. Emperors, cynically perhaps, used her name to justify their own moral campaigns, or to demand greater civic virtue from their citizens. And historians, for centuries, have debated whether the system truly empowered women or ultimately imprisoned them. Perhaps it was, as with many aspects of Roman life, both. Modern archaeologists continue to meticulously dig through the haunting ruins of their home near the Forum, uncovering rooms, statues, and offerings left behind. Even now, the House of the Vestals stands as a silent, powerful echo of lives once lived between prayer and profound peril. And though the sacred fire is long gone, something else remains: the enduring memory of women who defied the norms of their time, who walked the dangerous edge of privilege and punishment, who held Rome's very soul in their care, and sometimes, for it, paid the ultimate, unspeakable price. They weren't warriors. They weren't mothers in the traditional sense.
They were guardians of a flame that, in memory and legacy, outlasted the empire itself. And for that, Rome never quite let them go. Good night. May your dreams be filled with ancient whispers and gentle historical wonders. Rest well and sleep soundly.